I'm Professor Dezso, and I would like to welcome you to a video series on today's topic, which will be World War I. I have a master's degree from the University of Central Florida in history. I've had the pleasure of teaching history and humanities at Valencia College and Seminole State College in Orlando, Florida for the last 13 years. I'm pleased to bring you a series on the world wars. Our focus today will be the outbreak of World War I. So, World War I and World War II. World War II, the beginnings of World War II, now certainly World War II was the most calamitous event in human history as far as overall losses, millions of people who died. But the beginning of World War II is relatively easy to understand. Hitler attacks Poland in 1939, and World War II begins. World War I is a much more complicated situation. In order to understand the outbreak of World War I, we're going to have to go further back in history. And any discussion of World War I, we're going to have to take a look at the unification of Germany itself. Now, one thing a lot of people do not realize is that in human history, there has never been a Germany per se, or a united German state until 1871. Rather, if we begin our journey in the year 1648. 1648 was the end of a conflict known as the 30 Years' War. And at the end of that war, we have the usual shape of Germany, not a unified state, but rather a conglomeration of over 300 tiny, independent little countries, unified within a political boundary known as the Holy Roman Empire. Now, it's a joke among historians that of this Holy Roman Empire. It was not holy, it definitely was not Roman, and it was barely even an empire. Instead, in a region about the size of Texas, we have Central Europe, 300 little independent countries, most of them smaller than Minneapolis or St. Paul, but each one of them with their own currency, their own post office, and their own squabbling princes, kings, and various principalities. So this was in a unified structure called the Holy Roman Empire. And if you can see on my map, we have this little black boundary, and that is where the Holy Roman Empire was contained. But our quest is for discussing German unification. So the first thing we have to talk about then would be the wars of Napoleon. From the period of 1789 to 1815, 1789 being the outbreak of revolution in France, and 1815 being the end of the Napoleonic Wars. For that period, Europe was at an almost constant state of warfare. And in 1815, well, actually a little bit earlier than that, around 1807, during this conflict, Napoleon, the Emperor of the French, moving, conquering, occupying Central Europe, Napoleon dissolved the Holy Roman Empire and its 300 little independent countries and replaced it with a region that he called the Confederation of the Rhine. This reduced the 300 or so little tiny German principalities into roughly 24 small German states. And two of them, the largest, however, of these German countries, was Prussia in the north. Not Russia, but Prussia, and Austria in the south. The North German Prussians, having a very militaristic tradition, also were predominantly Lutheran, while Austria to the south was predominantly Roman Catholic. Now, Napoleon in 1815 was defeated at Waterloo, and the map of Europe was redrawn at that time in a peace conference known as the Treaty of Paris in 1815. And this peace conference brought together the five major powers of Europe, really of the world. The United States is not a particularly powerful nation at this point. So we have five major world powers: Great Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and France. And in 1815, this peace conference, known as the Treaty of Paris, with the defeat of France in 1815 and the exile of Napoleon, this peace conference, known as the Treaty of Paris. What is interesting about this peace conference is that it was not only a peace conference of the victor states of Europe. Rather, France was invited into this peace conference. The enemy, France, was invited into this peace conference as an equal participant. The idea was that you don't punish France for the sins of Napoleon. And as a result, the Treaty of Paris of 1815 was a fair peace. It was a just peace. And it maintained even the vanquished nation of France as an equal participant in a balance of power between these five major world powers. And this peace would last from 1815 to 1914. Europe would remain at a predominant state of peace, with no major European wars, at least wars that would draw in all the powers of Europe at this time. So we continue our discussion then, however, about German unity. After 1815, after the Napoleonic Wars, this left still Prussia in the north, having expanded its territory, and the west to the west in these central German states, and Austria in the south. But as the 19th century progressed, there became a wider movement for the cause of a unified Germany. More of a dream than any kind of reality that had ever been before. But nevertheless, there was a dream going through these German states of a unified Germany. And the two major powers in the two major German powers in Central Europe, Prussia and Austria, both Prussia and Austria wanted to be the vehicle by which Germany would be united. Our story then of German unification begins with a war against Denmark. Now, the Scandinavian nation of Denmark in medieval times was a rather powerful European kingdom. But in the 19th century, Denmark was definitely a minor European power. And Denmark, following the wars of Napoleon, Denmark in the early 19th century had incorporated two German states into its political structure. And those states were called Schleswig in the north and Holstein in the south. Many of the small German states were rather bitter that Denmark should incorporate these states into its constitutional framework, we might see. And ultimately, Prussia and Austria decided to go to war against Denmark in order to remove those two territories and keep them at least occupied by Germans. Denmark was rapidly defeated in 1866. There's no way that little Denmark could have held its strength against the might of Prussia and Austria. But with this very successful war for Austria and Prussia, the two territories were split, with northern Schleswig taken by the Prussians, and the Austrians allowed to take the southern province of Holstein. Now, as this progressed, as we go through the 1860s, Prussia, as I said, both Prussia and Austria wanted to be the primary vehicle to unify Germany. In order for the Prussians to travel to their northern state of Schleswig, this meant that Prussians would have to cross into Austrian-controlled Holstein. And as the 1860s progressed, the Prussians began publishing in newspapers to the small German states of Europe, saying how incompetent Austria was in administering Holstein. This caused Austria to be insulted bad enough to start a war with Prussia, which was exactly what Prussia wanted. And so, in a war between, a very brief war, between Austria and Prussia, Austria was defeated in 1867, and Prussia incorporated many of the northern small German states within the Prussian political framework that it called the North German Confederation. Thus, Prussia was achieving its goal of unifying the majority of these independent German states into a Prussian kingdom, a Prussian empire. But this left out three very important and very large German states to the south: Bavaria, Baden, and Württemberg. Bavaria, Baden, and Württemberg are some of the largest German states with the most population as well, the largest population. But also Bavaria, Baden, and Württemberg were all Roman Catholic states, whereas North German states, including Prussia, were Lutheran. So it is more probable that in a German union, that the South German states, Bavaria, Baden, and Württemberg, would probably ally themselves with Austria rather than Lutheran Prussia. Prussia understood this and knew that the only way that they could get those states to come into this German union, if these states felt threatened and needed Prussian protection. And the way that this came about was through war with a foreign power, war with an aggressor power, France. Now, often I've asked my students, if you think about European history, which nation do you think is the most aggressive power in Europe? Most of my students would usually say, well, Germany. And rightly spoken, given the 20th century and the two calamitous world wars of the 20th century. But interestingly enough, for most of European history, modern European history, and actually going all the way back to medieval times, France has been the major aggressive power of Europe. France had always been the most powerful kingdom in Europe, the largest military, and the most aggressive military powers. And France had an arch enemy, that is Great Britain. Great Britain and France had been at each other's throats for most of their history through medieval times into modern times. Now, in the year 1870, things were changing in Europe. Most notably, the monarch of Spain, in the southwest, Spanish king died, and a new king was put on the throne of Spain, who was related to the Prussian, or at least German, princes of Central Europe. Now, on top of this antagonized France, but it was made worse when French diplomats took a journey to the Prussian capital of Berlin and were rudely dismissed in a terribly rude and arrogant manner by the Prussian king. This was further published in the newspapers of Central Europe, and France was insulted and humiliated by all of this. On top of that, with Spain being to the southwest, with a new monarch on its throne related to the German princes of Central Europe, France began to feel that it was being surrounded on many sides, and the insult of dismissal was bad enough that France decided to declare war on Prussia in 1870, which was exactly what Prussia wanted to happen. And in 1870, a military conflict came out known as the Franco-Prussian War. Now, in this conflict, Prussians invaded through a corner of France called Alsace-Lorraine. And in the primary battle over here, at a small town known as Sedan, Prussian military forces completely surrounded and forced the largest contingent of French military forces in this part of the battlefield to surrender. And even more, the French Emperor Napoleon III was taken prisoner. The Prussians had secured a major military victory, and they went on further and closed in on Paris itself. Now, the Prussians laid siege to Paris for 3 years, and during this time, Parisians did their best to hold out. 3 months, not 3 years. But after 3 months had passed by, the Parisians were starving, and they eventually opened their gates and surrendered to the Prussians. A last French military attack was also thwarted, and France had to reluctantly face the reality that it had lost the war against Prussia. And so, in the Palace of Versailles, Versailles, about 10 miles outside of Paris, is the most glorious palace in all of Europe. This was built in the 1600s by King Louis XIV, probably the most powerful monarch in modern European history. Now, Louis XIV had created the most grand palace, really almost probably in the entire world, at Versailles. And it was at Versailles that the Prussian king was crowned now Emperor of the Germans. Germany had unified. With 1871, we now have a unified German Empire and the Prussian monarch crowned at Versailles. This was a terrible insult to the French, that the Germans should crown their new emperor at Versailles. Nothing could be more insulting. But someone insults you, someone makes a fool of you. You're angry, but given time, you can get over it. And the French could possibly have gotten over this were it not for the fact that the Germans rubbed salt into the wound of the situation by annexing a small strip of territory known as Alsace-Lorraine. Alsace-Lorraine. Now, let's talk a little bit about Alsace-Lorraine. The Alsatians, if you asked a person over in Alsace or Lorraine if they are German or French, they would not know how to answer that question. Actually, they wouldn't know what you're talking about. All Alsatians speak both German and French. Ask one, what do you speak at home? One Alsatian may speak German at home and French at school. Another could speak French at home and German at school. They don't care one way or the other. there was no need for Prussia, now Germany, to annex these territories. But it was a tremendous insult to France. And now on top of the fact that the German emperor had been crowned over in France, now all that any Frenchman had to do was look at a map of Europe and see the loss of those territories gone to the Germans. The French were outraged. And a slogan began over in France, and that slogan was, "Speak of it never, think of it always." Get revenge, somehow, on the Germans. Get revenge for this terrible insult. And by all means, somehow, get Alsace and Lorraine back. So, as we continue our story, as the 19th century progressed, the new unified German state, Germany became now overwhelmingly the most powerful country in Europe. Also with the largest economy in Europe. Now, Germany, with its overwhelming military, could face down any nation in Europe. No nation could hold up to a German military attack. Not Russia, not France, not Austria, not Italy. The balance of power that had been set in place with that effective peace treaty that I mentioned in 1815, the Treaty of Paris, that balance of power was now upset, with Germany now being overwhelmingly the most dominant power in Europe. Largest military, largest economy. However, one thing, while the Germans could defeat any single European power, what they could not do was defeat a coalition of powers. While Germany could hold off France or Russia or Austria, Germany could not hold off an alliance of France, Russia, and Austria and Italy against it. So one of the later monarchs, advisor to the monarch, Chancellor Bismarck, argued that Germany must do whatever is necessary to prevent a military alliance from ever happening between France and Russia, most especially. Because while Germany can face down either France or Russia, if a military alliance between France and Russia ever happened, Germany would not be able to fight successfully a war on two fronts. Thereby, Germany needed a military solution to that problem. And the proposal was, if we look at a map of Europe, France is relatively small, Russia is enormous. And if there was a war on two fronts between Germany against Russia and France simultaneously, how could Germany effectively deal with such a crisis? A military plan was developed. And this military plan is probably the most important military plan developed in the late 19th century, early 20th century, known as the Schlieffen Plan. So, the Schlieffen Plan. Essentially, the object of the Schlieffen Plan is to smash through the borders of France with the greatest concentration of German military forces. And then just hold off Russia long enough for France to be crushed militarily by Germany. And then, after France is defeated, Germany can take its time with Russia. But the problem is that Germany attacked in the Franco-Prussian War through Alsace-Lorraine. The French were expecting that attack to come again. So the Germans had to revise another plan. And the Schlieffen Plan called for violation of Belgian neutrality, to smash through Belgium from the north, sweep around Paris from the west as the French advance into Alsace-Lorraine, thereby capturing both Paris and encircling the French military forces in a lightning move. This became the Schlieffen Plan, and it was the most top secret military plan in German military history, and it was kept on reserve. Some historians argue that by around the year 1900, maybe 20 Germans even knew of this plan at the highest circles of the German high command. But in our story, we have to take a look at another country. Now, as the 19th century progressed, Germany began to start feeling isolated, and also that it had fewer and fewer friends. Now, when you don't really have any friends, but you have one loyal friend, you tend to hang on to that loyal friend. And as the 19th century progressed, and as we reach into the early 20th century, Germany began to feel that it had only one true friend that it could count on, and that was Austria. Now, Austria was the most problematic country in Europe. The Austrian Empire goes back to late medieval times, but Austria is a drastically multinational state. Austrian Germans are a minority in their own country. This map shows an ethnographic breakdown in Austria showing its minorities. The Germans only being Austrian Germans, 25% of the population, but also including Czechs, Poles, Ukrainians, Hungarians, Romanians, Croats, Slovenes, and even Italians. All of these in a very, very problematic state. Now, in order to make governance of these minorities easier, in 1867, the Austrians decided to split their monarchy in two and hand over immense political power to the second largest minority besides the Germans in the empire, and these were the Hungarians. And so in 1867, in the so-called Ausgleich, or Compromise of 1867, the Austrian state became now a dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. That is, the Emperor of Austria was now also simultaneously King of Hungary, and Hungary had immense political independence in this structure. So in 1867, it is now an Austro-Hungarian state. But the Hungarians, often in the past wanting independence, let alone political power, the Hungarians were very satisfied with this peace process, but it went to their heads. And they began to basically oppress many of the minorities that were in their state, such as Slovaks and Romanians most especially. So the Austrian state remained extremely problematic as we advance into the 20th century. Now, there is another area of Europe that is very, very problematic. The southeast region of Europe known as the Balkans. And in the Balkans, from the late 19th century, we had three major powers that had been contesting with one another for expanded political power in the Balkans. And these three regions were Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Turkey, Ottoman Turkey. Now, Turkey had control. The Ottoman Turkish Empire had controlled most of the Balkans, but began losing that power in the late 1800s. And as Turkey was forced to withdraw most of its influence from the Balkans, new political states began to arise in the Balkans. These included Romania, Bulgaria, and probably most importantly, Serbia. Now, the Serbs only had very recently an independent state, but the Serbs were dedicated to the idea of creating a single ethnically Slavic Balkan state, a South Slav, a Yugoslav state. And that's what Yugoslav means, or Yugoslavia means. It means a South Slavic people or state. Slavic is a language group. It's one of the largest language groups in Europe. Some of the Slavic languages would include Russian, Polish, Ukrainian, Bulgarian, and Serbian, and even Czech and Slovak as well. Serbia was dedicated to the cause of a Yugoslavia, of expanding this Serbian state. But Austria-Hungary had also been expanding over in the Balkans, and especially to the south, in an area that was particularly complex called Bosnia. Now, Bosnia had immense ethnic and religious divisions. Bosnia, for example, is a home of Serbs, Croats, and Bosnians. Further, the Croats tend to be Roman Catholic, the Serbs tend to be Greek Orthodox, and many Bosnians are Muslim. It's a very volatile area, and Serbia hoped that it would be able to expand in that area and extend its dream of a Yugoslav state under Serbian control, or at the very least, influence. But in 1910, Austria had moved into Bosnia, and it also formally annexed Bosnia to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Serbs were outraged. Nevertheless, Austria-Hungary had expanded its influence. Austria had the support also of Germany. But Germany itself also had lost its last potential political ally, which was Great Britain. As I said, the most militaristic power in Europe had not been Germany, German-speaking nations, but France. And the archenemy of France had always been Great Britain. And often in the modern European wars, the ally of Great Britain against France was usually Prussia, that country that had unified Germany. But as we move into the late 19th century to the early 20th century, Germany has a new emperor, or Kaiser, and his name is Wilhelm II. And Kaiser Wilhelm II was basically a brat. He had come from a very, very privileged upbringing. He knew very, very little about politics or effectively governing people. And he antagonized Great Britain because the Kaiser began to greatly expand the German navy. Germany had no need of a navy. Yes, Germany had, since 1880, gained some colonies around the world. Southwest Africa, East Africa, Cameroon and West Africa, some regions of the Pacific. But this brat of a Kaiser, who simply loved to have mock naval battles in rooms of his palace, he would have the whole floor with a big hex map, little ships moving along those having mock battles. The Kaiser liked ships and wanted to expand the German Navy. Until by around 1910, the German Navy was roughly about 1/3 of the size of the British Navy. Germany does not need a navy that large. That antagonized the British. 1/3 size of the British Navy, that's huge beyond imagination and much larger than any needs of the German state. Germany thus, by expansion of its navy, had pushed away the only power that could possibly have balanced things in the event of a conflict, and that's Great Britain. Turning our attention back. So, truly, Germany only had one friend that it could count on, Austria-Hungary. But situations would soon go very, very bad in Austria-Hungary. The capital of Bosnia was Sarajevo. And on June 28th, the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, Franz Ferdinand, made a political trip to the capital of Bosnia on June 28, 1914. Now, a little bit about the Archduke. In a European monarchy, the Archduke is a position that is subordinate only to the position of emperor. And the Emperor of Austria, so he's Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary. The Emperor of Austria-Hungary is a man by the name of Franz Joseph. But Franz Joseph is 85 years old. He is 85 years old and in poor health. When Franz Joseph, who looks like he's going to die any day now, when he dies, Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke, will become the new Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary. I don't know why he and his wife journeyed to Bosnia in that summer day of 1914. He really had no business there. But nevertheless, on June 28, 1914, Franz Ferdinand driving with his wife in open limousine. A terrorist jumped in front of the car and fired shots into the chest of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and into his wife. They were rapidly taken to a local hospital in Sarajevo, and both were dead within hours. The Archduke, the future Emperor of Austria-Hungary, has been assassinated. And the nations of Europe are shocked. The Germans are shocked. And the Russians are shocked. And the French and the British and the Americans are shocked and send their sympathies to Austria-Hungary. But the Austrians began to investigate the assassination. And it turned out the assassin was a member of a terrorist group called the Black Hand. And the Black Hand had ties to the Serbian government itself. Now, Austria-Hungary gave Serbia a set of 12 demands and said that unless Serbia comply with these 12 demands, Austria-Hungary will declare war on Serbia. The Austrians examined these demands and were willing to accept 11 of them, but they refused the 12th. The 12th would have given Austria-Hungary complete control over all police, the entire police force in Serbia. Serbia said, no way, they will not hand over their police force to a foreign power, the Austro-Hungarians. They will not surrender their police force to Austria-Hungary. And Austria-Hungary said, if they do not comply, war will come between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Now, Serbia is a Slavic language state, but the largest Slavic language state is Russia. And Russia has always seen itself as kind of the big brother to the other smaller Slavic-speaking regions of Europe. And Russia announced ominously that if a military conflict comes between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, Russia will back Serbia against Austria-Hungary. But then Germany announces that if Russia supports Serbia against Austria-Hungary, Germany will support Austria-Hungary against Serbia and Russia. But France said if Germany and Austria side against Serbia and Russia, France will support Russia and Serbia in an alliance against Germany and Austria. Turkey announced that if France and Russia and Serbia act against Germany and Austria-Hungary, that Serbia also will be declared war upon by Turkey, which will side also against Russia and France. You see the potential tripwires that we have at this point? Well, Austria-Hungary on June 29th, 1914, declared war against Serbia. And Russia declared that it will support Serbia militarily and will begin to mobilize along the Austro-Hungarian border. The Russian military began to mobilize across that border, but then also began to mobilize along the German borders as well. And the German military command was startled and terrified by that prospect. So, Kaiser Wilhelm II, now, interestingly enough, the Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany and the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, actually they're first cousins, and actually very good friends. And they had often written letters to one another. And the language they used, since they both spoke probably about 5 or 6 European languages, those letters were in English. English was the language that Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia wrote in. But Germany demanded Russia explain, why are Russian military forces mobilizing against Germany if Austria-Hungary is the power that Russia is mobilizing against? Russia, Tsar Nicholas of Russia, said with honesty that this is not meant to be a threat against Germany. Simply, the Russian military is a little bit more backward than other militaries in Europe, and that Russia can only fully mobilize its military, cannot do a partial military mobilization. Therefore, as Tsar Nicholas said, this is not meant to be a direct military threat to Germany. This is a move against Austria-Hungary. But the Russians are mobilizing across the entire German border, and France has publicly announced that if there is a conflict, France will militarily back both Russia and Serbia. The German military command went into shock and said the doomsday scenario that they have dreaded has now come about. A military alliance between France and Russia against Germany. And the German military command declared it is time to deploy the Schlieffen Plan. Now, in very rapid succession, the major powers of Europe stumbled into war with one another. So, to briefly summarize the different powers that stumbled into this conflict, we turn to this map that I have over here, and I hope you can see the best we can. What became known as the Central Powers, or nations that are allied to Germany, would include Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and Ottoman Turkey. What would be called the Entente or Allied Powers would include France, Russia, Italy. Talk about Great Britain in just a moment. Now, our goal in this lecture is to discuss the outbreak and root causes of World War I. We will take a look in another lecture of the military experience of World War I. But suffice it to say, I will just briefly introduce what happened and what were the consequences of the German Schlieffen Plan. Germany, in the Schlieffen Plan, proposed to march through neutral Belgium. You cannot simply march into a neutral European state, however, according to the laws of diplomacy of the 19th century. That violates basically every diplomatic law that had been established in the 19th century. Belgium is a neutral country. You cannot simply violate another country's neutrality. But Germany felt it had no other choice in order to succeed militarily against France in accordance with the Schlieffen Plan. Therefore, with the invasion of Belgium, this outraged Great Britain further. and said that Germany has completely upset the balance of power. The British were already antagonized by the expansion of the German Navy, but now with violation of Belgian neutrality, Great Britain also declared war on Germany. And then Austria declared war on Britain, and then the whole sequence went on again for all those powers. I will speak then about the conclusion of the Schlieffen Plan. The Germans felt that they could just simply walk into and brush aside the Belgians in their advance into France. But the Germans did not count on the Belgians resisting. And the Belgians did more than resist. The Belgians fought like lions. And they slowed down the timetable, of the Schlieffen Plan. And by the time the Germans were able to make it into northern France, the French troops were prepared. And at the river known as the Marne, slightly north of Paris, the Germans were halted. And eventually, in the western front, in the western areas of France, the war would stagnate into a stalemate on the western front between Germany and France. What would follow for the next 4 years would be the greatest human calamity that had ever come to modern global history, World War I. By the time that conflict would end, over 40 million people would be affected. Over 20 million wounded, over 20 million dead. Half of those, 10 million of those dead, civilians. The First World War has started, called at its time the Great War. And this would encompass a wholesale human slaughter than had ever been seen before. New weapons of war are being used in World War I. They were untested. Nobody knew their consequences. The airplane, the submarine, poison gas, and most horrifically, as we shall see, the machine gun. Thank you.